Today's episode is sponsored by our friends over at Z-Biotics. Today's video is about Patek Philippe and how we all missed a tremendous boat on a watch that was so obviously underpriced, it's kind of offensive. It's actually kind of bothersome that none of us bought this watch. The idea of this episode came about because I was reading the John Lennon Patek Philippe 2499 story, and I'll talk to you about that watch that may or may not be stolen, and you know, this wild watch. The value between $10 and $40 million is the estimate, and the custody of this watch is in a rather hot debate between an Italian gentleman and Yoko Ono, who's still alive, I guess. Jesus Christ. So today's episode is going to be great. Before we get into this, what I think is $30 million Patek Philippe, let's get into the watch that we all should have bought and didn't. And let's also talk about why it was so obvious that it was a winner, that it was going to appreciate, and also why we didn't buy it, because there are reasons too. There are reasons why none of us were smart enough to buy them. The reference, or rather the year, is 1986. Patek Philippe is coming off of the back of one of the greatest references, not just in Patek Philippe history, but in watch history. In fact, maybe even broader than that, in art history. The 2499, which was Patek Philippe's second reference of their perpetual calendar chronograph, the first one being the 1518, and again, the second one being 2499, which ran in 4 different series. Now, a series means, while the references remain the same, and then the idea and the concept of the watches remain the same, slightly different iterations, slightly different evolutions. In the Rolex world, we would call them Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3. Maybe it's a different color bezel. Maybe it's a slightly changed dial. All these little changes happen, but they don't fundamentally change the watch. Now, in the different series, 2499, you can actually argue the first series has different pushers. It doesn't matter. The point is, 2499 is one of the greatest watches ever. I think it may actually be the greatest watch ever. Only about 350 of them were ever manufactured. I believe the official quote is 349 of them were ever manufactured. And they're incredibly valuable, incredibly collectible. They are, along with the 2448, maybe, the greatest wristwatches ever. They're so elegant. They understood proportion. They understood elegance and how to balance it with substance, right? Something that, Cartier had wrestled with back in the 1920s, something that the same brand had, maybe not succeeded at later on. This is a hard balance. How do you create something that is ultra rich and ultra elegant while still feeling like it matters? Right? And when you have a really, really small watch, it's only elegant, doesn't achieve that balance, it doesn't hit those notes, right? But the successor to that 2499 is a reference 3970, and that's going to be the subject of today's conversation. The watch was introduced in 1986 and ran until 2004, so it had quite a long run. Manufactured in all different sorts of metals and quite a few dial iterations. The rarest of them being, rather collectible and valuable, hundreds of thousands of dollars, sure. But when I got into the watch business, and I don't just mean 10 years ago, I mean up into the last probably 5 years, 6 years, these watches were, relatively speaking, affordable, relatively speaking, to the world of vintage Patek Philippe perpetual calendar chronographs. This is the basically peak Patek. And you could get them, and they were for sale between $50,000 and $70,000, depending on, dial condition, how motivated the dealer was to sell, right? $50,000 to $70,000, with most being between $50,000 and $65,000. I remember these watches being in that price range. I remember when these watches were, a great one was 60 grand. I mean, a great model was 60 grand, some of them even being less than that. And nobody wanted them, despite the writing being on the wall, despite the fact that an objective observer would say, oh, wow, in the grand scheme of Patek Philippe perpetual calendar chronograph, this is grossly underpriced, right? The successors and the predecessors are far more valuable than this, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars. Not only is this undervalued now, it is certainly poised to appreciate over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And that's a huge part of this, by the way. I mean, I don't want to, and this channel has never stood for, making watches exclusively a collector's class. That's not, or an investor's class, rather. But to ignore, what is obvious, mobility and value would be silly, right? truly prime Patek Philippe is a great investment, right? Generally speaking, these watches continue to rise in value because their lore grows, and fewer examples by the year are available in the market in great condition, and I mean, they're collector's items. So anything that's a true collector's item where the quantity is limited, collectors will bid. So why then, around 60 grand, when all of its comps were in the hundreds of thousands, why didn't we all buy these watches? In no particular order. But first answer is the era that we were looking in. Watches in the last 10 years have become smaller and more conservative. That's true, right? All brands have really brought back a level of refinement to their wristwatches that maybe, they had strayed away from the decade prior. But a remnant of that skepticism about elegance certainly remained, for sure. And it took thought leaders like Ben Clymer from Hodinkee, like Alessandro Squarzi from Instagram and Fortella. It took people wearing elegant watches publicly and kind of, emotionally co-signing, right? It took key opinion leaders seeing these watches, wearing them, and then everyone else saying, oh, wow, that actually is quite neat. Patek Philippe 3940 perpetual counter in yellow gold is actually kind of cool. Yeah, it looks like an old man's watch, but if you wear it like a young guy, maybe it's cool. And then people in Silicon Valley had them, and the culture moved. But going back eight years, if you were to buy an elegant Patek Philippe, you were definitely a, relatively speaking, early adopter into the modern wave of elegance, particularly in expensive brands. Right. So it was early. The culture wasn't quite aligned. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends over at ZBiotics, which it really is one of our favorite partners in this channel because ZBiotics has saved my butt many, many mornings. After drinking, I am so grateful that I primed my night with ZBiotics, the world's first genetically engineered probiotic, to mitigate the symptoms the day before, mitigate the consequences. There's nothing I love more than not having to face the consequences of my own actions, and ZBiotics is exactly that. Engineered by a team of PhD microbiologists, ZBiotics is a probiotic drink that breaks down the byproduct of alcohol, which is responsible for rough mornings after drinking. And it's so easy to use. For your best results, make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. That's not very difficult. Number two, obviously, pace yourself, be responsible, hydrate, get a good night's sleep. Night's sleep is huge for me. And step three is just enjoy the next day. Don't feel as sluggish. Don't feel as beat up. There's nothing I hate more than waking up the next day after a nice night with friends or family and celebrating and enjoying life, then regretting it the next day after. It's awful, absolutely awful. And I haven't done that in a very long time because I've been a ZBiotics fan and client for over a year now. And the point of this is not to encourage over drinking. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The point is that we want to have a healthier lifestyle because tomorrow does matter, right? I hate that very childish idea of living for right now. But what about tomorrow? I have work. Maybe it's a weekday. Maybe it's a Saturday, and I want to just not be miserable, right? I don't want to be uncomfortable. I want to feel better, and that's where ZBiotics comes in handy. So I couldn't possibly recommend more that you go to zbiotics.com/Theo and Harris to get 15% off of your first order. That is zbiotics.com/Theo and Harris for 15% off of your first order of just a better tomorrow after those nights you just don't want to miss. Second, the 3970 was actually smaller than its predecessor, which is odd, right? I mean, the 2499 you would expect, being decades older, would even be smaller, right? You would expect that with time came size. But no, the watch they released in 1986, the 3970, was actually 1.5 millimeters smaller. It doesn't necessarily sound like a big difference, but it's not nothing. It's certainly noticeable, which sounds crazy, but is true. And second, when you've got a watch that's so complicated, you're fitting a heck of a lot onto that dial. So the watch was smaller and the dial may have felt a little bit cramped. It's also, to be fair, impossible to match success of what essentially was perfection. How, when you've got the 2499 in your rotation, how do you replace it and succeed? How? This happened years later as well with the 5270, and then its successor, the 5370. 5370 is great. It's a great watch, and it's perfect for many people. But how do you follow up a perfect act? How do you follow up a 5970 in white gold, a flawless watch, a watch that while I've been observing the watch industry, went from $120,000 all the way up to well over $200,000. But now these 3970s are trading easily above $140,000, and they're going way further, right? Some of these models are above 200 and even further. This was, while obvious 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, well, obvious to a third-party viewer, I guess just in many ways unheard of, right? A 3970 being a collector's item was not it. The culture around that watch, was that it was kind of the poor man's provincial calendar chronograph, right? Period. It had no cachet. It had no clout. And we were all wrong, and we were all stupid. And I don't just mean this, by the way, because we should have all made that $60,000. I don't mean that 60, 70, 80,000 bucks. I'm not even sour about the profit that we all missed out on. I'm not sour about the 60, 70 grand. It's fine. After taxes, it would have been half that anyway, right? I'm being cheeky, but it's true. Screw that. What I mean more so is, if you're a real watch enthusiast, it is easy when you look at the last 10 years to think, oh, geez, I missed my opportunity to own something that was world class for real watch. And that burns a real watch enthusiast, because it's not about clout. Like, you were a 3970 out, no one's looking at you. Nobody cares. No one thinks, if your game is clout, if your game is to look rich, 3970, not doing it. Guaranteed. 5970, not doing it. 2499, not doing it. No one's going to care. No one's going to know. Relative, of course, there are a couple of uber wealthy collectors or, normal people that are like really niche and into watches that would see it, but really nobody knows. Nobody cares. A gold Rolex, sure. Nautilus, sure. These are clout watches. These are watches that you get credit for if that's your game. But these watches aren't about that. If you want a 3970, if you want a 2499, if you want to, whatever, all these different references of all perpetuals and chronographs and all this stuff, you're not from Patek. You're not really doing it for clout, generally. You're doing it because you have fallen very, very deeply into a hobby. You have become, indoctrinated basically into this. You're deeply in love with the history of Patek Philippe. You're deeply, knowledgeable probably about the significance of their developments, right? You know what this company has meant to the world. Right? You probably appreciate they're still independent. You probably could write a poem about the Calatrava, right? Like, if you're about to spend $100,000 on a watch that nobody cares about, that probably means that you're really into this. Like, you're a dork. Like you're probably a dork, like me, right? So there is a level of it that kind of feels like, did the dork miss his chance? And that's kind of the impetus for the video. It's not that I'm sad about the 70 grand in profit that we all could have made. It's more of an abstract, a stand-in for, just a larger life lesson, which is, the good guy, the guy that does things for the right reasons, doesn't always get, right, unless he forces it, doesn't always get what he wants and doesn't always get what he deserves, right? Because a truly great, knowledgeable collector, you would think on an emotional level, would be able to get a great watch at the right price and not have to stand on the line and beg and still then pay triple what he could have paid 2 years ago. Now, when you are uber high income, it doesn't matter, then who cares? God bless. But for a lot of watch geeks that I know that don't go out to dinner or go out to dinner less frequently and go on vacations less and treat themselves less and all these other spaces, like they don't go and do a whole other bunch of things. It does feel bad when they don't pull the trigger, and then, while they're saving, the prices go up and up and up and up and up, because their goal, their dream, the manifestation is further away. So again, I don't feel sorrow here, but it certainly is a sad sentiment. I wish that everyone could, get the watch they deserve, the watch that they've read about 1 million times. I wish that we could all, get a Patek Philippe perpetual counter chronograph. It's a ridiculous idea, but you know, I don't know. And this happens on a smaller level. This happened with pole routers. This happened with a whole bunch of different watches. This happened with, you know, vintage cool chronographs, vintage Longines, so many things. You know, while knowledgeable, passionate people were saving money or being a little indecisive because they're responsible, you know, the prices went up 2, 3, 4, 5x. It's crazy. It's crazy. So the point of the video, I suppose, before I get into John Lennon, is, you know, if all logic is pointing toward appreciation, forget investment. Think of it more as, you know, if all logic is pointing to the fact that this watch that you could buy now is not going to be within reach in 2 years, pull the trigger. You know, worst case, you sell it, and if you don't connect with it and you break even or whatever, make a couple bucks, lose a couple bucks, it's not the end of the world. Right, especially in a luxury hobby like this, right? We can't, you know, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you, sort of thing, right? It is what it is. But try to be a little objective. Try to be a student of the market and of history. And it's funny that I could speak at length about, you know, when to invest in Patek Philippe. I don't know anything about the stock market, but I guess that's just bad priorities. Long story short, I'm going to link an article down below that was in the New Yorker, I think, about John Lennon's Patek Philippe $24.99. It was a gift from Yoko Ono for his birthday in 1980, just a little bit before he died. A photo was taken of him by a New York photographer that kind of was viral. No one really knew if it was his watch, but the point is that that watch had transferred ownership quite a bit, ended up in Switzerland, and it's basically been the subject of a custody battle, essentially. The current owner, well, he doesn't have possession of it because it's been seized on allegations of theft. The current owner bought that watch a couple of years ago, and Yoko Ono is alleging that it was stolen from you know, John Lennon's apartment, from John Lennon's home. But that being said, she's also admitted that she was giving some of John Lennon's items away to staff as signs of appreciation for their service to their family, and she did admit to specifically offering part of the staff one of his watches, just one of my watches. Take a watch, and apparently they took this Patek Philippe $24.99, this, you know, $20 to $40 million watch, and she didn't notice it was gone until just a couple of years ago. So for 40 years, essentially, she didn't even know this watch was gone, and now she's alleging that it never rightfully belonged to the person who owned it, and then went on to sell it years later when they needed cash. You know, just as a general note, you know, sounds like Yoko Ono's batshit nuts. She shouldn't get the watch. That's just my opinion. I go with my gut a lot, and usually your gut's right. She'll probably end up with the watch because she probably, I don't know, she has better lawyers, or it's too difficult to prove, or who knows, whatever. But if I were to tell Sam behind the camera here, hey bud, thanks for your help. By the way, go into the apartment, you know, pick out anything you want as kind of a gift for your service. Like, pick out whatever you want. And he picks out a really sentimental item, right, to me, right? He didn't know that, or did, whatever. That's kind of my fault, not his. And it seems to me that that's a fair transfer of ownership. Should he get documentation that this transfer had happened? Yeah, probably. That makes sense. That's just good legal practice. Is that how human beings behave? Not really. If you give me a gift, I usually just take it, right? I don't really ask you to sign paperwork to say that you gave it to me. But I don't like Yoko Ono. I also don't like John Lennon. So I don't really have a horse in this race. I just sounds to me like Yoko Ono's out of her mind. But anyway, that's it. God bless America, and see you all soon. Like this channel and subscribe for more videos about watches. See you all soon.